Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast. Before we begin, I'd like to review some quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar audio is streamed through your computer speakers. If you need technical assistance with the web interface or audio, please reach out to us using the chat window. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the chat window, and we will answer as many of them as possible at the end. If we don't get to answer your questions, we will follow up via email. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email following the webinar with a link to the recording. We encourage you to share this link with your colleagues who weren't able to make it today. Your presenters today are Carol Whitberry and Bill Hammond. Bill, over to you.
Thanks, Jess. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining Carol and I today. We're looking forward to sharing some important information with you, help you understand the risks of malware and the things you can do in your IBM environment to mitigate those risks. And I'm really happy to welcome Carol Whitberry from DXR Security to join us today. Precisely in DXR, have been working closely together to help deliver more education and better security solutions for our IBM customers. And as most of you are probably already aware, Carol is the leading voice in the IBM security space, and we're again very happy to have her here to present today. Her experience includes not only founding her own companies, but working at several other companies, including IBM and a lot of the leading firms in the IBM world. And even beyond the deep corporate experience, Carol has literally written a book on IBM security. It's called IBM Security Administration and Compliance, and I would highly recommend picking up a copy. It's very good. So Carol, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you for today's topic. So go for it.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate the opportunity. So when Bill talked to me about doing a webinar for precisely, we were talking about different topics, and we thought about this one because literally when my business partner, John Vanderwall, and I formed DXR Security the middle of last year, the first 3 calls that we received were about reducing the risk of malware infection on IFS and IFS security. So it seemed like a timely topic and something that would help the IBM community reduce the risk of infection. So that's how the topic came about. Hopefully you will find it timely as well. So during this chat, I'll be talking about malware and IBM what that really looks like, the way that file shares play in that, the permissions on the objects that are being shared, how the net server configuration can play in the risk to malware, how education is really key to this whole thing, and some things that you can do to be prepared. So, malware on IBM So fortunately, knock on some wood, wherever you can find it around you, there is no current malware for IBM proper. That's not to say that there never could be, but one would really have to be written specifically for IBM to have it infect the operating system as we know it. But there are 2 ways that malware can infect IBM One is that an infected object, something that has already been infected with malware, gets somehow stored on IBM in the IFS. Think, and this is really how the whole thing started, old QDLS. Remember the old document library services used to be that a document could get infected and then it was uploaded to QDLS, and then the next person that opened that document would be infected and so forth. And that can still happen today. So it's resident in IBM But the other way that is more prevalent in today's world, and something that is first and foremost in people's minds, is that malware comes in through a file share after first infecting a workstation and then comes up and affects IBM And truth be told, that is really what the key issue today. If someone were to ask me what is the biggest risk on IBM today, it's malware infection, in my opinion. And so I'm not going to talk about that other variation, but what I want to talk about today is the way that you can reduce the risk of having malware come in from an infected workstation and infect your IBM I. So what is your current risk level? And before I get into the risk level, I want to say that malware comes in a lot of different varieties. And so a lot of people just think of ransomware, and that's the primary focus in today's world. But there are other types of ransomware that can affect IBM I as well. We had one client that had malware come through, and it renamed all of their directories. So somebody clicked on the wrong link on their workstation, and the workstation had all of their directory structure renamed, and it marched right over to IBM I and renamed all the directories that it had authority to in the IFS. So I'm not just talking about ransomware. There's many different variants of malware today. So what I'd like you to think about today is really what is your current risk level. So if one of these people would click on the wrong link or somehow go to a website and it deposited a payload and somehow their workstation got infected, what is the risk to your IBM I system? If it could be not just your IBM I, but it could be, depending on how that workstation is configured and how your network is configured, it could be your entire data center is at risk. And we have actually seen that happen. So what we're trying to do is, what I'm trying to do in this chat today is help you come up with ways that that risk is not your entire data center, but is just reduced to some minimal things so that you can avoid business disruption. When we have seen infection throughout an entire data center, I want you to put yourself in those people's shoes. Think about it if your entire infrastructure was infected with some type of malware, be it ransomware or something else. What would the outage be to your business? And how much would you have to do? What all would you have to recover to come up and be back in business? That's the type of business disruption I'm talking about, and that's the type of business disruption we want to avoid. So this is all about reducing risk, skinny down that risk to something that is much more manageable and is not your entire data center. Okay, so focusing on IBM I, the key to this whole thing is your file shares and how they have been defined. The absolute worst possible scenario that you can come up with is that there is a read-write share to root. Why is that so bad? That's because in this risk level, put in this pretty picture of a data center, make that your IBM I system and all your partitions. So if you have a read-write share to root, your risk is to the entire system, because sharing root doesn't just share the IFS and your directory structure, but it also shares qsys.lib. So again, the worst possible thing that you can do is have a read-write share to root. Your risk level is that entire IBM I partition. Okay, so how do we reduce that risk? Let's start talking about how file shares work on IBM I. So they're different than in the Windows world. In the Windows world, you can actually say, hey, Carol can use this share and Bill can't. That's not the way it works on IBM I. They call them permissions on the share, but it's not that one person can use it and the other person can't. So you have to look at how the share was defined, and the permissions on a share, in this case, is whether it allows read-only or it allows read-write. Okay, so that's the permissions in the terms of shares on IBMI. So it's a combination of how the share has been defined along with the authority that the user has to the directory or whatever is being shared. So I say whatever is being shared because I have seen qsys.lib, so your entire library structure being shared. I have seen people who have shared individual files. So it's sharing an object does not mean you're just sharing a directory. You can actually share whatever you want to. So you have to look at what has been shared. So one of the goals that you want to do is to remove unused shares. I have seen insight into a lot of systems in the IBMI world, and most of the time there are shares that have been defined that people no longer use. And it makes sense because unless you're focused on this, you have so much on your plate that you probably wouldn't even think to go in and look at shares to see if they're still being used or not. But I have seen many shares that are no longer used. So you want to remove those shares if they're not being used. Okay, so that's one way that you can reduce risk, remove unused shares. Then the other thing that you want to do is when the shares have been defined, and in the past, the default was to create a share as read-write. That default, I believe, has been changed to create new shares as read-only, but in the past, most people defaulted their shares to read-write. You know, most people take the defaults, including myself. So if you can, you want to make sure that you reduce the shares to be read-only. And that way, even if somebody has authority to the underlying directory that would normally let them write to the directory, if someone is using a share that has been defined as read-only, that's all they can do. So they would need both authority to the directory, we'll assume in this case, and a read share. But no matter what authority that they have, if they have all authority to the underlying directory, if it's a read-only share, they can only read. So that will reduce the risk of the malware doing harm on IBMI proper. Also, let me step back. File shares are the key to malware entering your system, because if there's no share, they can't get to the system. Malware doesn't leap through the air. It does a lot of harm. It does some clever things, but it doesn't leap through the air. So it has to have an entry point into the system, and the way that happens is through a mapped drive to a share. Okay, so you're going to reduce the risk, you're going to remove the unused shares. You're going to reduce the share to read-only. If you're only downloading things via a mapped drive, so maybe there's a process that runs nightly that puts a file in a directory, and then you download it to your workstation and consume the information. As long as you're not uploading back up to that directory, why would you have a read-write share? All you need is a read-only share in that case. You're also going to want to look at the authority to the objects that are being shared. All right, so we'll go through this in a little bit more detail. So again, just a little bit of a better visual about what people can do with these shares. If it's a read share, if the person has at least read authority to the contents being shared, they can read it, meaning they can download it, but the contents cannot be updated regardless of what that user has to the underlying object. If it's a read-write share, and the user has at least read, they can download it, they can read it. If the user has at least write authority, they can also modify it. And that's where the real danger comes, especially with ransomware. They're going to want to encrypt that data. So if the person that is connected from the workstation via a map drive to that share does not have write authority to that object, that malware, that ransomware will not be able to encrypt the data. So the user, bottom line is that the user must have sufficient authority for the operation being attempted. Okay. So again, here's that mapped drive to root. So literally, so I've done this from my workstation and I put in a read write share to root. Literally, I have exposed my entire system to any kind of malware that has infected my workstation. All right? So how do you go about analyzing file shares? There's a couple ways to do it. The most popular probably is through Navigator for Eyes, so the web browser interface. So you go down to File Systems, and then at the end of that section is a section called File Shares, and you can click on that, and then you can see the file shares that have been defined for your system. And again, wouldn't surprise me if there's shares there that have not been used in a really long time. Or if you're into SQL, there's a relatively new SQL service that has been defined that allows us to bring back the file share information through a service. So I've listed it here along with the level of the system that you need to be at to be able to use that. It did just come out in the latest TR. Okay, so again, review in your steps of reducing risk. Once you've gotten rid of the unused shares, that's one level of risk reduction. And I'll talk more about why you want to get rid of those shares when I talk about the net server configuration. Then you want to review those read-write shares. Okay, again, if you can reduce it to read-only, that's best. But if write access is required, this is where you want to look at the object that is being shared with a write access. And sometimes it is required. So you want to take a look at the contents of that directory that is being shared. Now, say it's a read-write share, and it's the share that is used by yourself or operators to download image catalogs to apply PTF. Honestly, who cares, right? I don't care about securing that. And if that got infected and encrypted, honestly, who cares? But if that is a critical piece, if that is a directory that holds a critical piece of your manufacturing capability, maybe you have a PC on your manufacturing floor that scans items as they go through your manufacturing line, and it's uploading that information to a directory, and then something picks that up and does something to it. That's a critical part of your business. Say that was encrypted. What kind of disruption would that be? So in that case, to reduce the risk, what you want to do is to make sure that the people that are authorized to write to that directory are really only the people that have a business need to write to that directory. So in this case, maybe it would be the group profile of the people on the manufacturing line and not the rest of your accounts payable and finance and legal and all the rest of the people, right? So you've limited it down to just the people who need access to that directory. And that way, the risk of infection, of having that directory infected is limited to the people that are in that one group profile. So again, this is all about risk reduction. Now, I will say with a caveat, don't forget about the users that have all objects, because even though you may put public exclude and have that directory owned by that group profile in manufacturing, guess what? All object is going to triumph over that public exclude, and they're going to have access as well. So again, this is one of those times where you really want to limit the number of users that have all object, again, to reduce the risk of having malware infect the system. Okay, so again, you're going to look at your read-write shares. You're going to reduce those to read if possible. You really want to look at all of the shares. Look at all the remaining shares, delete if not used, and why is it a danger, or why may it look like people are using a share when they're really probably not. I've seen this happen. When you go to map a drive on IBM I, one of the options is to say reconnect at sign-on. And so instead of it being like a one-use thing, or you have to remap every time you use that share, if you say reconnect at sign-on or log on, then every time you reboot your PC, it's going to reconnect that share. A lot of times, people don't need to reconnect every day. Maybe they need it once a month. So I would suggest that you want to review when people have that reconnect at sign-on checked. And if you see a share that is in use, but it doesn't seem like it should be, that's one way that it could have happened. The other thing that you want to do, just like your other privileges, when somebody changes jobs, maybe they don't need access to that share anymore. So you want to review when they have access to a share. Again, maybe they don't need to map to that share anymore if they have changed positions. The other thing is that to prepare and to reduce the risk to your entire organization, you really want to be looking at all of the shares that are defined. Shares to Windows servers, shares that are defined on your workstations. I had a workstation in the previous place that I worked that was issued to me, and there were no fewer than 5 shares defined on that laptop that I never used. And they connected every time I signed on. And I have no idea what they did or where they went, because I didn't need to go there. But that's the type of configuration that needs to be reviewed. So look at your laptop images and make sure that it's not connecting something for people that don't need to go there or don't need to go there all the time. So that's why I mean you can reduce the risk throughout your entire organization. So when you're using the shares on IBM I and you see that it's in use, and let me go back a few screens to show you how you know when it's in use. It is, so you can see the current users. So if you're going through Navigator for I, you can see that you have a current users. And if they are currently attached right now, that number will be greater than 0. You can also get that information through the file share service. Okay. So if you see that shares are in use, the way that you find out who is using it is to actually click on that share in the Navigator for I view, click on the share, and click Properties. And when you get to Properties, go to Sessions, and it's going to list who is actually connected to that share. So when we've helped clients get rid of a share to root, this is really key to know who is mapping directly to root so that we could remap them to a share that was to a subdirectory under root and not directly to root. So this is key in the exercise of being able to remap users. Now, why do you want to review read-only shares? Yeah, well, the problem with malware is that it is ever evolving. The people who are doing this are doing it to make a profit. They're doing it to make a living, and they are ever changing to try to avoid being caught or to be able to ensure that they get the ransom paid. So the latest trick that people are doing is that they are exfiltrating, meaning downloading the data prior to encrypting it. So it used to be that all you had to do was get rid of the read-write shares, and then the system was safe. So doing that means that the data is still safe from being encrypted. However, it is not safe. A read-only share allows data to be downloaded. And so the data can still be, in the terms of ransomware, exfiltrated, even though it can't be encrypted. So, again, that's why you get rid of shares that are no longer needed. So, again, you want to go through the same type of exercise that you go through with the read-write shares. What is actually being shared in this case, even for the read-only shares? So, again, if it's something like PTFs or fixes or the latest access client solutions or, something that you don't care about being downloaded, then I really wouldn't worry about it. But maybe you're in the healthcare industry and you're storing images out there of injuries or images of, if you're in retail, your credit card information or images of orders. Maybe your payroll data is out there. I've seen a lot of confidential data in the IFS. So now even those read-only shares and what is being shared needs to be analyzed. And again, the way to reduce risk is that you reduce the access, the underlying permissions to the directory to only those users that actually need access to that data. So again, in the case of, if you're in healthcare, your accounts payable, your legal team, your purchasing does not need access to medical images. So you would reduce the access to that directory containing those images to just the group profiles or individuals that needed access to that information. So that's why you have to look at the read-only shares as well. So I talked a lot about directory permissions. The reason that most directories are wide open is because IBM ships root wide open. It's the equivalent of public star all. And because of that, when directories are created under root, they inherit that same public authority. So unless you take action, those directories are also the equivalent of public star all. Okay, so that's how this problem has gotten propagated. So one of the things you might want to do as part of this exercise is to actually go ahead and secure root to the recommended value, which is read only. That allows you to traverse or go through root to a subdirectory, but it wouldn't let you create something directly into root. So before you do that, and for anybody that's ever listened to me speak before, I'm big on not breaking things. You want to make sure that nothing is being created into root before you make this change. So make sure you do that first. The other thing, the question I often get about this is, once you secure root down to read only, does that change affect the rest of the IFS? And the answer is no, as long as you don't take the option to apply it to all the subdirectories. So the default is not, so take the default, and you will only be changing root. And from then on, the less open public authority will be inherited when you create directories into root. Okay, so some additional steps to take. You can hide shares from being discovered. So when you go to map a drive, one of the things that you can do is browse to see what shares are available to you. So if you create the share and add a $sign at the end of the share name, that share will not be shown in that list when you go to browse. So in other words, somebody would have to know the name to be able to use it. Security by obscurity. Yes, that's what it is. The other thing, which is more powerful, is to turn off the broadcasting of the net server. So basically, again, somebody would have to know it's there. So this is definitely the case, and this is why I say get rid of shares that are no longer in use, because the default is to broadcast the net server. So the other thing that malware has started to do is to come in, and it used to be that somebody clicked on a link and immediately their workstation started to get infected. And of course you knew what was happening because you couldn't do certain options and you get all sorts of weird screens, and then it would go through the map drives and IBM would be infected immediately. Now what is happening is that malware will often lie dormant for a little bit and do kind of some recon. It might look through the network to find out what kind of systems are there and see if they want to go and do any more harm in the network other than just do ransomware, if that wasn't enough. But it will often drop a payload and phone home with some information, and there are people that actually look through the information to see if they want to do even more than just encrypt various systems. So if you turned off the broadcasting of the net server, then it's not going to be available for that payload to find your IBM system. Okay, so that's just one method of hiding that from the bad people. The other thing is if a guest profile has been assigned to the net server, you want to remove it. So the way that you do some of these things is that, again, you go into Navigator for I, you choose Network, Servers, TCP/IP, you go to the IBM Net Server, choose Properties. So to get rid of the guest profile, you go down to Security. If there is anything listed here in this space, then that's the name of your guest profile. If it's blank, you don't have a guest profile assigned. So what I've found when a guest profile is assigned on IBM systems, it's usually that it's been there forever. Like people, when the IFS first came out in version 3, started to play around with it, and they really didn't know what to do with it, and they might have assigned a guest profile at that time, and most of the time the administrator doesn't even realize it's there. So a guest profile in this case allows you to go in and map a drive, use a file share, and not even have an IBM profile yourself. You don't have to enter a user ID and password, and you're signed on as with the privileges of whatever profile is named here. So that's typically no good, and you want to get that removed. All right. Then the way to stop broadcasting your net server is to go in and choose the Advanced tab, and by default it is broadcasting. So you would take that, say Next Start, and uncheck the box that says Send Browse Announcements. So again, to further reduce the risk, and again, I'm all about risk reduction. So we've gone from the entire system, and we've whittled it down to, various pieces of the operating system and various pieces of the IFS. To further reduce it, there's some other things that you can do. If you have, in particular, shared qsys.lib or shared root, you can actually hide qsys.lib when you're looking at it via the Windows Explorer, or like if you've mapped a drive, or the Navigator for I view. And so if I went back to Navigator for I, if I did not have access to this very funny sounding authorization list, QPWF server, which ships with the operating system, if I didn't have authority to that, I would not see qsys.lib in my list. Now remember, if I have all object, I'm going to see qsys.lib. But if the user does not have all object and you set the public authority to exclude for this authorization list, they're not going to see it in the view. Again, it has no actual effect on the actual authority that people have to it. It just blocks it from those two access points. Now, the cool thing is that it also blocks malware getting to qsys.lib as well. I mean, it actually physically stops it from going to qsys.lib, not the rest of the IFS, but qsys.lib. The other layer of defense, and again, you've heard me speak before, I'm big into multiple layers of defense. Exit programs. If you have exit point software, there's an exit point for the net server. Use it so that you can control which users can actually come in via a file share. The other thing you can consider is MFA, so you can have a multi-factor authentication. Say you have that malware that has lied dormant before it actually goes out and tries to encrypt. If you have not connected to a file share and you get a request for an additional factor to connect to the IFS, would you not think that that's a red flag? Hopefully you wouldn't provide that, multi-factor for the net server in that case, but you can use it as an alert factor that something's going wrong in your network. And then the other thing is to consider network segmentation. A lot of these malware events, when you hear in the news that people have been down for several days, a lot of times is that because they have a very flat network and the malware has been able to run rampant across the entire organization. So consider network segmentation. So if one area of your business gets affected, it's not going to affect the entire thing. So now that we've talked through all of these areas and steps that you can take to reduce risk, if we think of what is our risk to IDMI at this point in time, hopefully it is just a handful of paths that need read-only access, and then it's only authorized to that set of users. And then maybe one or two read-write directories, shares to a directory that absolutely requires that you have write access as well. But again, only authorized to those users that need access to that information. And in the process, hopefully you've done some things like secured some confidential information, reduced the number of all object users, and in the process added multiple layers of defense. So if one thing doesn't catch the intrusion, then the next thing will, and so forth. Now, education is really the key. So again, malware doesn't just magically appear. Something had to happen to introduce it into your network. So the security awareness training is key to helping people avoid downloading, going to the wrong sites, clicking on the wrong links, giving information to people through phone or text or through email compromise. Education is really key to fight off the effects of malware. The other thing to make sure of is that you have educated people to know who to call if they think that they have been infected. So it's one thing to educate people on what not to do, but if they actually do it, do they know who to call or what to do? I think that that's just as important as educating them on what not to do. It's interesting, I saw this on, there's a 2021 State of the Fish report from Proofpoint. They're a company that does like, they scan email and they help you avoid phishing emails. But I thought it was really interesting what was the success of the phishing attacks, and 60% of people lost data. right, and credential account compromise. This is an example of the malware when it's a business account compromise or credential account compromise. This is a case where that payload has been downloaded and they are basically sniffing out your network. That's another reason why even internal communications should be encrypted, okay, to help avoid that. Ransomware infection, 47%, almost 50% of phishing attacks result in ransomware infection. That's pretty awful. Or other malware infection. So it is a huge business disruption. So anything that you can do to reduce the risk, I think, is really important. Backups are a must. It used to be that all you needed to do was back things up and you could recover. Now with the exfiltration of data, you still have to be very concerned about that, but backups are still key because if the data is encrypted, it's not 100% guaranteed that you are going to get that encryption or decryption key. Not all ransomware provides the decryption key, even if you pay the ransom. So backups are a must. And make sure that they're stored separately. There's some malware out there that actually targets the backup extension in Windows servers. So make sure you're storing those offsite. So if infected, pull out your incident response plan. Now, I put this in here because the very first call that we got when we formed DXR Security was a gentleman that had searched the internet, found my name, and called because they had been infected with ransomware, and he clearly had no clue what to do. They had a screen on their system that says, you have been infected, here's how you pay the ransom. They were already starting to set up some sort of Bitcoin account to call, but he was in a panic. And again, clearly had no incident response plan. He didn't have any clue who to call to help him get it cleaned up, to make sure that they were still not under attack. So if you learn nothing more out of this webinar, then you need to have a plan. I will be glad. Hopefully you've learned more than that, but I hope that you understand that you must have an incident response plan to make sure that you know what to do in the awful event that this happens. All right? So I know that there's always some time where you've missed some things. I've tried to put in references for the things that I referenced in this webinar, and so that's available for your information. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
Carol, thank you very much. It's very informative stuff, a lot to see and learn there. And I'll just reiterate too, Carol's resources there are going to be great. But remember, you'll also get the slide deck. We'll be following up and sending that to all of you. So I know there were a lot of screenshots with a lot of important tips in there. So rest assured you'll be able to get those so that you can make use of those yourself. So I just want to spend a real quick minute here at the end before we take some questions in the Q&A box about how Precisely can help in this area. You know, Precisely has our Assure Security offering, which is our IBM security solutions, and that's a broad-based sort of product, but it really can be broken down into a couple of different areas. Where we have compliance and monitoring capabilities with a couple of the modules there. We have a couple of modules dedicated to data privacy that are important. But in the context of what Carol talked about today, you know, our access control solutions are probably the most relevant thing for you to understand. So if you look on the left-hand side of this chart here, our Assure Access Control modules, we have a System Access Manager, which is how you manage exit points, and Carol talked about the importance of those. So System Access Manager could be valuable for you there. Multi-factor authentication came up as a really important topic here, and our multi-factor authentication offering here, very flexible and very powerful, can help with this ransomware and mitigating those risks by keeping unauthorized people from actually accessing the system. And then finally, the elevated authority manager piece is all about managing the authority levels that people have in the IBM I environment. And, so things like being able to eliminate the need to assign users all objects directly to their profiles and things like that can be managed through the elevated authority manager piece. So again, I encourage you to take a look at precisely the Assure security offering because it can help you with some of our tools in helping mitigate the malware and ransomware risks that Carol was just expounding out for our conversation today. So with that being said, I will move us into the Q&A portion. We have a couple of different questions that have come in for Carol, it looks like, and let me just see how many of these we can get to. Probably the first one, Carol, here we've got, do you find that the volume of shares that accumulate over time becomes overwhelming to admins, so to the point that they don't even look at it? Is there an en masse or a batch sort of way of applying changes to large groups of shares at once?
I don't know of a way to change those en masse, and you might be able to delete them en masse in Navigator for I, but I don't know of a way to actually go in and change like from a read write to a read en masse.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yep. And that's part of the problem. I mean, file shares are a lot of things that people don't routinely review, and so you kind of have to stare at them for a while and look at them and make sure they're really not in use.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for that. Next one here, how to prevent backup from being infected when the server is infected. I think the answer there is just, your backups are there because you got them from a pre-infection standpoint and you can go back to them. But is that really what we're looking at there, Carol, preventing backup from being infected?
Yep. You want to store them offline, off the system, and off-site, like outside of your network.
Got it.
So that if your entire network goes, you have some other place to go to that backup.
This one's pretty specific to SAP, but I'll see if you've got any insight on it. The person's asking, our application created a share to root called rootbin upon installation. It's set to read write and widely known in the SAP world. So in your experience, would you know if we can change that share to read only, or should we reach out to SAP on this?
Yeah, I do not know. You'd have to reach out to SAP. One thing that I think a lot of people, I think that there's a misconception that you have to share root to share something else below it, and you don't. You do not need to share root first. So what you want to do is to make sure that you're sharing at the lowest possible level. So, yeah, I would reach out to SAP on that one. And you need to tell them that that's not a good practice. I mean, they're putting their customers at risk.
Not recommended, yes.
Not recommended.
Actually, because there's two very related questions. I think they're both asking the same thing here, but you showed how to determine if anyone is using a share in real time, but is there a way to see when a share was last used?
Yeah, unfortunately, that is not easy. So you can see in the screenshots that I showed, it will show active users if they are actively attached at the moment, but that's like a point in time. So if you have any thought that users are going to be, or maybe some automated process is going to be attaching like in the middle of the night, what we've done with some customers is to take that IBM I service, the file share service, put that in a CL program and gather the active sessions and run the CL program like every 5 minutes. And so you can kind of gather it by timestamp. And do it that way. But there is, unfortunately, no last use date on a file share. It'd be really handy if there was, but unfortunately there is not. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Okay, looks like there was one that says, is there a way to see if the writes are being done? So you can change to read only. So if there's a write, there should be like a creation of object audit journal entry that should be corresponding to the to whatever's being shared. And I would think that you could do it that way. Okay.
Thank you, Carol. I don't know if Bill had dropped, but I'm happy to continue.
Yeah, yeah. Bill looks like he's had his call drop. Oh, that's okay. I can read them. Let's see. Have I ever used the green screen option? But thank you. But this is good. Have I ever used the green screen option for the net server management Go Nets? Yeah, actually I have. It doesn't come with the system, but it is free. And so you can use it from more of a command line access. I don't know if it's any more or less helpful, but I have used it, and it does reflect what's on that server. Let's see. Got both of those. SAP, yeah, got that one. Okay. I mentioned MFA. Is it really a viable option for IBMI? Yeah. You know, MFA in general, I realize can be a pain, right? Because it's not just your user ID and password. You actually have to enter something else. So it makes logging on to whatever you're logging on to not as easy. But it prevents so many things. I don't know if you have heard of the attack on a water plant in Florida a couple weeks ago. They just had a remote access tool, and they haven't said what it's coming to. There was a water plant that was running IBMI several years ago that got breached. So I don't know if this one was also running IBMI, but the way that they got into the network was that they had an unencrypted remote access point, and that multiple people were using. So there were multiple problems with that scenario. But if that person had been using multi-factor authentication, then the hacker couldn't have gotten in. That's bottom line. And so in the case where malware has dumped a payload and it's looking across your network, especially if you have not encrypted sessions, the transmission internally, they can easily steal credentials. So if credentials have been stolen either that way, or maybe your personal credentials have been stolen and you happen to use the same, you know, at work as you do at home, which a lot of people do. It's not best practice, but that's what they do. If you have that second factor, then even if your credentials are stolen, then MFA will prevent that from attack from being successful. So do I think it's viable on IBMI? Yeah, I actually do. Yep. Okay.
Sorry, Carol, I dropped, but I was able to finally dial back in, so I'm here.
No worries. My phone was discharging. I was hoping I had to plug in real quick myself, so not a problem.
All right. I apologize to you and the audience. But we are going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Carol, again, I want to thank you for your time. This is very informative. I hope all you out there in the audience got a lot out of it. And again, I'll reiterate, you'll get the slides, so all that helpful information you saw will be there. And have great rest of the day, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future. Thank you.